Hello, I'm Tammy Bond. I'm a civil and environmental engineering professor here at Illinois, and I'm here to introduce our lunchtime speaker. We face a worldwide challenge related to energy used in households. Not here in Illinois so much, although there is a little in the United States. Billions of people still lack access to reliable power, and many still cook, light, or heat their homes using fire in the home, an environmental and health hazard. A few years ago, an airline passenger bound for New Delhi looked down at a river of smoke and reflected, "The haze is our loudest smoke signal, an immense version of that wisp of smoke rising from a chimney on a distant hill, and one of the largest man-made objects visible from space." Most of the particles in that vast soup come from the home fires of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, from 1.5 billion daily acts of survival. That passenger was Jonathan Mingle, our lunchtime speaker, a freelance journalist whose writing on the environment, energy, climate, development, and South Asia has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, the Los Angeles Times, Quartz, and the Boston Globe. He's the author of the book Fire and Ice, Soot, Solidarity, and Survival on the Roof of the World, a nonfiction narrative published by St. Martin's Press in 2015 about black carbon pollution and its health and climate impacts around the world and in a village close to his heart. Jonathan earned his bachelor's degree at Dartmouth College and holds a Master of Science from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California at Berkeley. He's worked as a consultant for the World Health Organization on household energy and air pollution, and as a researcher on social enterprise at Harvard Business School. He has been a Middlebury Fellow in Environmental Journalism, and he is a recipient of the American Alpine Club's Zach Martin Breaking Barriers Award, which is given to ice and rock climbers and mountain explorers who perform humanitarian service with lasting impacts in the local communities around their climbing expeditions. Jonathan reminds us in his book, in many ways, the story of fire is the story of humanity. We may only have become fully human in both the biological and the social sense once we learned to control the flames. This is the adventure in which we are all engaged as energy scholars and in the iSEE Congress Energy 2030. Jonathan referred to his book as a tale told around the fire, the cornerstone on which this young collective venture of ours, roughly filed under the rubric of civilization, has been built. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Mingle for a tale told around the fire. And after that, please buy his book.
Thank you, Tammy. So, hi everyone. Let me just cue this up here. And let's see. I'll find it. Tony? Well, while we're doing that, let me just say thanks, Tammy, for that kind introduction, and thank you also for your research and work on this issue, which informed a great deal of the book that she mentioned. So I'm very much in your debt. Great, thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Madhu, and the other folks behind organizing this Congress and for the invitation to speak. I'm a journalist. I'm someone who writes about climate, energy, science. So being here the last couple days is kind of like being a kid in a candy store. There's so many potential stories here that I can't wait to go home and translate into pitches to various outlets. So being that I am primarily a storyteller, I was thinking about what can I add to the conversations happening here. And I figured I might as well just tell you a story. And so the story that I'm going to tell you today is about, we just heard about energy frontiers, pretty high tech. I'm going to tell you a story about another kind of energy frontier. And this story takes place in this village. So this is Kumik. Kumik is a village of about 50 households high in the Indian Himalaya. So this is in a region called Zanskar. And the story of this village is really at the heart of the book. And as you can see, it's a high altitude setting. It lies in the rain shadow formed by the high Himalaya. And that might be the primary fact to take away about, if you're wondering, what is it like to live in this place? It's very arid. You know, it's a lot like Tibet, and the people in this village are primarily Tibetan Buddhists. So you see it way up there at the tip of India in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. That it doesn't even show up on the map, Zanskar. That's kind of how remote and forgotten it tends to be. And these are some folks from Kumik. And I first encountered Kumik 8 or 9 years ago when I was working in the region as a grad student. I was at Berkeley, and I was working with local organizations who were trying to promote this idea of passive solar heating. So another important fact about life in this rain shadow is, well, it doesn't rain a lot, so all of their water comes from that snow and ice that maybe, you know, you can see it right up there. So these permanent snowfields, glaciers fed not by summer precipitation, but by winter snows, that is all of the water they have to work with in this part of the world. And so I was there 8 or 9 years ago and trying to work with some local communities on passive solar heating strategies. Because one benefit of living in the rain shadow is that it's really sunny. They get 320 days of pretty clear sunshine a year. It's a very abundant resource. And I met this gentleman. He sought me out because he was building a new house. His name is Tashi Stobden, and he became a central character in the book. And he explained to me that he was building a new house, and he heard I knew something about passive solar heating, where you, through orientation and building envelope strategies and thermal mass, you can heat your home with the sun and not have to burn fuels like dung, wood, which is mostly what they use, mostly dung, yak dung, sheep dung, through the long winter, which can last 7 months, during which they're closed off from the rest of the world by heavy snow. So Zanskar, the 20,000 people of Zanskar are really on their own for more than half the year, right? We talk about the last mile in energy supply chains. They're the last 150 miles. They're really at the end of the road. And he explained to me when I asked, well, why are you building a new house, which is kind of unusual, given that water is so finite, arable land is finite. And so people tend to not build in places where they could cultivate food. It's still largely a subsistence economy. Half their diet, they grow barley, peas, and they keep animals like yaks and cows and sheep and goats. And he explained the situation, and he invited me to come to his village, so I did. And there you can see it all for yourselves. The only source of water for this village is there are a couple glaciers up on top of that mountain, a few kilometers away, and some permanent snowfields. And those have been retreating over the last few decades pretty dramatically. And that was the story that everyone told me, not only in this village, but in the villages across the valley. They've been watching this. They have a front row seat to this for the last few decades. And this stream is their only water source, right, to irrigate fields for 50 households. And this gentleman, Ishe Pauldun, is the oldest man in Kumik. He's probably in his mid-80s now. I met him on the first day I went there in 2008. And he pointed out the window and he said, you know, when I was a kid, those snowfields almost came down to the village. And now they're several kilometers they've retreated up the hillside like puddles evaporating. And, you know, the message that came through very clearly through that conversation and many more that I had that summer and over repeated visits for a few years was, you know, this is it. This is their water tank, and it's disappearing. And I went up there eventually with some folks and looked around, and these fragmented glaciers, and as they fragment further, they're surrounded by dark ground that it soaks up the sun and radiates the heat and speeds up the melting further in a feedback loop. And that's the consequence. The canal runs dry most years by August, before the harvest. So they frequently lose harvests for themselves, but also for their animals, which are kind of the linchpin of their traditional economy. Their draft power, they thresh grain with the animals, they milk them, they use their dung as their primary energy source for cooking and heating. So a problem, a pretty serious problem. And this is a storage pond. This is a typical scene. And you might be hard to make out, but you know, it's kind of like when you're cold, your body shunts blood to your core organs to keep you alive. In Kumik, the way they do that is, with scarce water, they leave these fields around the outer edge of the village fallow, right? So they're retreating back to fields close to the village. And so the trends that they described were really two. It snows less and less every year. And remember, this is an entirely snow-dependent economy. And it melts, what does fall, melts sooner and sooner every year. So that leaves them high and dry by August, harvest time. And this led them to a difficult decision. So, you know, I spent a lot of time in this village, and it's a beautiful village. I don't know if that comes through in the photos, but it really is kind of what you'd imagine a picture postcard Himalayan village to be. And I would, after drinking lots of butter tea, and we're talking about the situation, and I would say, oh, you know, this is tough. Aren't you sad to leave this place? And it's probably the oldest village in this valley, Zanskar, which means it's at least 1,000 years old. And they would just look at me and say, you know, what are you, well, they wouldn't say it, but the look on their face would say, what are you, thick? Like, we don't have water. We don't have a choice. We have to leave. And as a journalist, I get to ask these stupid questions over and over. And they put up with me, but after a while, they're like, look, you know, without water, you have nothing. So they decided to move 3 or 4 kilometers away, 1,000 feet lower, near a river. The logic being, okay, our stream is drying up, but if we locate near a river that, you know, flows out of the catchment of many glaciers and snowfields in the whole eastern part of Zanskar, well, you know, we'll have some time. That buys us some time before whatever trend we're observing, you know, intensifies. And so they decided they would irrigate this wasteland, really, is what it is. They went to the government said, yeah, sure, take it, you know, it's no man's land. And they had a lottery, so it was fair, and everyone got the same size plot, and they started building houses themselves with very little help from the government or the outside world. And this is Stolden, the gentleman whose photo you just saw, the first guy I met from Kumik. This is his house that he wanted me to see and say, like, how can we make it passive solar heated? And he looked around, he toured me around this place, and he said, you know, he has this vision for the future. We're going to make this place green. All we need is water and, you know, sweat equity, and we're going to get it done. And he looked at me, he's like, and by the way, you can see the old village right up there, and it's this plain stretching out like an alluvial fan down below it. Stobden said, isn't it great? And I was like, yeah, it's great. And I was thinking, no, it looks like Mars. You know, it's a really dry, dusty, windy, hot place. And in fact, their name for this place in their language is Martang, the red place. But they think they're going to make the red place green by doing this. And we spent a day hacking this little canal out of the earth to bring water, because I got roped into, well before I thought, you know, I would write a book about this, I got roped into helping the village with a passive solar heated community hall. And so we had to mix mud for the bricks and concrete, and that's how we got our water. So, I left that first summer. I was really nagged by my encounter with these folks, and I had promised to come back and work with them. But, I was really left with three questions, and one of them was, he had used this phrase, Kumik is the first village in Zanskar, the oldest village in this region. One of the toughest places to live on the planet. Temperatures go down to negative 30 degrees. You're cut off from all supply chains for more than half the year. And he used this phrase, Kumik is being destroyed. And I thought, what is destroying Kumik? And then also, how are they going to do this? How are they going to build this village, kind of reinvent the life that took many generations of recycling nutrients into the soil from their animals and their own waste, and it's like the original permaculture in a way. How are they going to do this in the space of less than a generation? Rebuild without any help. And then why was that guy Stolden laughing about all this? He found this was a great cosmic joke or something. So that motivated the book, and the book led me to a discovery, a kind of a shocking discovery for me. It also led me to research by Tammy Bond, your own Tammy Bond, and other pioneering researchers like Veerabhadran Ramanathan at Scripps and many others who have been pointing out that we've been overlooking a major source of climate warming pollution, and that is black carbon. Soot, it's the stuff in soot, Tammy can fact check me here, but the stuff in soot that makes it dark. It's the most efficient absorber of sunlight, of any pollution we put in the atmosphere. I've heard Tammy describe it as think of microscopic dark rocks suspended, and they're soaking up light, they're re-radiating it as heat, and they do that in the atmosphere, but not only there, when they settle out, these particles on snow and ice, they reduce the albedo, right? The amount of light reflected back to space, and just pour energy into that snowpack and those glaciers. And that is, northeast India. There's the Arc of the Himalaya, the Bay of Bengal, and this is a seasonal pattern you see. As Tammy read a brief passage from my book. Anyone who's flown over North India, the Gangetic Plain, let's say October, especially when farmers in Punjab are burning their rice straw, and you know what this is like. And that pollution is lapping at the feet of the Himalaya and making its way up into these valleys that we think of as, these mountains as monolithic and unchanging and remote. But people who go up there and dig snow pits are finding a fair amount of this stuff reaching as high as the slopes of Mount Everest, where it accelerates the melting. So there's the background influence of just globally average climate change, due to greenhouse gases. But then there's this stuff, which tends to stay close to home. Black carbon stays in the atmosphere for a week or 2 weeks on average before it settles out. So that means sources close to these glaciers tend to have an outsized impact on their decline. And so here's an image from Tammy led an exhaustive review of all the ways in which black carbon contributes to warming and cooling in the atmosphere, and you add them all up with the uncertainties, and their conclusion was that it's the second biggest contributor to radiative forcing after carbon dioxide. And that schematic nicely captures all the different mechanisms, including this albedo reduction effect. And what are the consequences of that? So these are photos from David Brashears. He's a kind of a well-known mountaineer who's now dedicated his life to documenting these pretty shocking changes. You can see it for yourself. That top photo is the Rongbuk Glacier in 1923, taken by Mallory, and the bottom one was 2007, taken by David. And you can see for yourself not only the retreat, but the thinning, the vertical decline. And that's been observed in a lot of places. And that has consequences like this glacial lake on the other side of Mount Everest at the head of the Khumbu Valley, which is growing. That didn't exist in 1960. Now it's well over a square kilometer. And I talk to the people downstream, and they're well aware of it. And they say not only that, there are many other lakes up there that they reach when they're grazing their animals or guiding mountaineering parties. And that is a concern, right? A sword of Damocles hanging over you if you live in this part of the world. If all of that water bursts through that natural moraine dam all at once. So it's a serious issue that I felt was kind of not being talked about, and that also partly motivated the book. And what are the sources? The sources are diesel transport, that's Tibet, road paving crew, some diesel trucks, brick kilns, small industry, on the outside of New Delhi, using coal very inefficiently. So the other thing I should add is black carbon is just produced whenever we use flaming combustion to burn a fuel incompletely. It's kind of like wasted fuel, right? It's these, hold the spoon over a candle, right? And you look under the spoon, and that's what you got. You got soot, because you've interfered with the combustion process. And a big source, 25% of global black carbon emissions, is from the household, from the residential sector, from people like, this is my friend Zangmo in Kumek, the wife of Tashi Stobden, who you saw earlier, in the herders' huts, making tea for me, lighting a dung fire by dipping it in kerosene and lighting some yak dung. And here's another community event in Kumek, similar deal. It's kind of a hazy picture because it's really smoky, right? These are not energy-dense fuels. They're not being used in high-tech devices. These are simple stoves, mud stoves, simple metal stoves, open hearths. And so it's not very high-quality combustion happening. And what are the health consequences of this? When I first learned this, I was shocked. I still find it shocking. Household air pollution, according to the latest best global burden of disease estimates, kills 4.3 million people every year. Outdoor air pollution, of which at least 12% comes from households, 3.7 million premature deaths a year. And that, a World Bank study came out just a couple weeks ago asking, what does that cost the global economy? Conservative estimate, $5 trillion. Just looking at the dailies, the disability adjusted life years, the loss of those people early when they could be productive. And that doesn't even include other costs which are hidden to most economic analyses. So these are women in Kumek gathering dung to fire their hearths through the winter. They'll burn one basket of that dung per day for heating. And that takes time. The young women do it too. And then guess who's managing the stoves and stoking the fires? It's the women, and the children tend to be in the kitchen right there with them, which is why pneumonia is the #1 killer of children under 5 worldwide. Half of those deaths come from exposure to household air pollution from cooking fires. And all of this was crystallized for me. This is actually not in Zanskar. This is in Nepal. So in the course of researching the book, I went to China and Nepal and Bhutan and other places. I just talked to people about how they cook and other sources of black carbon too. And I talked to this woman, her name was Kunzang. She was holding her baby, and I was looking at the stove and the soot kind of climbing up the wall. And she described how they have to walk 2 days to get pine wood and bring it back, and they'd rather be doing other things, but what are you going to do? And I said, wow, is the smoke bad, with your baby? And she just rolled her eyes at me. Again, a journalist asking a stupid question, but that's my job sometimes. And she said, yeah, of course the smoke is bad, but what are we going to do? We have to eat, right? So that's what it comes down to. Those emissions, the black carbon problem, at least that slice of it, is an energy access problem. People don't have access to clean, affordable alternatives. The stuff that we use in our homes, gas, electricity for cooking, and heating. And so they're forced to live with this. So from there, I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about what is the current state of affairs with respect to energy access. Well, we've heard some speakers mention these numbers. The latest best guess is 3.1 billion without access to clean cooking. So these are folks who rely on solid fuels largely, dung, coal, biomass, and kerosene to a limited extent, and then which was recently categorized as a polluting fuel by the WHO. And then 1.1 billion without electricity connections at all, and then another billion or so who have pretty unreliable access, sporadic access to electricity. And so with the book, a real motivation of the book was I want to tell the story of black carbon because, and Tammy and I have talked about this, not so much that black carbon itself, is the most interesting thing. It is. I find it interesting, but I realize not everyone would. But I came to view it as kind of like a tracer fluid for this kind of coupled human atmosphere, cryosphere, vascular system we have, in the sense that it lights up these hidden connections that we don't tend to see. We don't tend to see places like Kumik and Zanskar. But by looking at black carbon, I thought maybe we'd start to see this energy access problem and also other forms of waste, which is what it is, in other sectors of the economy, like a lot of this comes from diesel or open burning of waste. And so that's the book. So now I'm gonna plow forward and give you the sequel to the book. I went back there in May, and I hadn't been back in 2 years since the book came out. And I wanted to visit and see how things were going in the new village and bring some copies of the book. And we got there in May, mid-May, just after the road was open, right? So the one road into Zanskar, 260-kilometer long road, which is really like, I live in Vermont, and I have a gravel driveway that's pretty rough. This is like a 260-kilometer long gravel driveway, but much worse than mine. And they had just cleared the snow, the Army, generating a fair amount of black carbon, clearing other snow while they do it. And my first stop is usually to this gentleman's house. His name is Ergen Dorje. He's an old friend, and we're catching up, and he said, oh, let's cook some food. It's a long journey, you're tired. And so he goes upstairs and he starts cooking on the stove. It's a kerosene stove here. This is kind of a traditional metal dung stove they use for heating and cooking. And I said, Ergen, why are you using the kerosene stove? Because normally he would use gas, propane gas, in cylinders. They're subsidized. People can buy a certain number every month, or every year rather, 10 or 12 a year at a subsidized rate by the central government. And he told me the big news in Zanskar that winter was they ran out of gas. Ran out of gas, still had kerosene, but were running low. So he'd been cooking with kerosene for a while, which is not a great way to cook. This is a kerosene heating stove that he set up in my room one night when it was cold. And it's just, kerosene's a nasty fuel. It's the leading cause of poisoning of kids. I once caught his kid drinking kerosene out of a can when he was very young because someone had left it on the floor. And I said, Ergen, you know what, you could take this out. I'm cold, but I'm okay. I don't need it because it was leaking and smoky. And after catching up with Ergen on that news, I went to Kumik. And Kumik was looking good, as it always does, even though the water vice is tightening around them year after year. And this is a pretty typical scene on one of their stately mud brick homes, piles of brush, dung that they store up for the winter. And they had also had the same problem, ran out of propane gas. So what do you fall back on? You fall back on a mountain of dung, right? And the other thing, again, Zanskar being in the rain shadow, not a lot of trees grow, and what trees do grow, they save for building materials. So they don't tend to burn a lot of wood. But when I asked, so what's new? How's everything going in the new village? They said, oh, not good. There was a landslide that backed up the river where we're going to get our water. That blew. It took out all the bridges in Zanskar except for one. It's like Job. It's like, what next? And so we don't have water in the new village. It's a big setback. But there's a silver lining. I said, oh, what's that? The flood brought a lot of driftwood, right? So people have been gathering the driftwood for the winter. Always like my neighbors in Vermont, getting their wood in, always thinking about the winter. And, a quick taxonomy of other energy sources there. When we're talking about energy access, I think the conversation tends to focus on, and I'll get to this in a moment, electricity, which is understandable because a lot of people don't have it. They don't have light. They burn kerosene in lamps for lighting. But in Zanskar, as in every other place, it means a lot more than that. So having useful energy for farming, this is the traditional tractor, the Zoe. It's a cross between a yak and a cow. It's like the ideal draft animal for plowing, for threshing. They use it for everything. And that's me trying to learn how to plow with the Zoe. It's really hard. It's harder than it looks. And this is the modern version. The Eicher tractor runs on diesel. And to give you a sense of how powerful it is and why so many people want them, it's, if the human output is like max 100 watts of power, a draft horse or a Zoe, maybe 500, 600, 700 watts, that's 18,000 watts. And they can do what would take them weeks, threshing the grain, grinding it, milling it with these elegant water-powered grain mills in a couple hours, right? So who wouldn't take that deal? But guess what else they were running out of in Zanskar? Diesel, right? So what had happened, I'll get to that in a moment. This is not Kumik, but another household in another village. And it gives you a great sense, I think, of what's called fuel stacking. So fuel stacking, household energy researchers talk about fuel stacking, which is really just the use of many different devices in parallel to do the things you want to do. And so, I'm sure if I just picked on one of you at random and asked what's in your kitchen, we could find 10 different devices: a coffee maker, a toaster oven, an oven, a gas stove top, range, and on and on. It's the same in Zanskar. So there's a box full of dung, and that little bottle is full of kerosene. And there's a thermos, which once you boil your water and tea, keeps it hot because they drink like 30 cups of tea a day. It's very important. There's a pressure cooker up on a gas burner. So when there is gas, propane gas, great. That's a great fuel. That's what a lot of us use, gas. But now they have to mostly rely on the dung and the kerosene. And then this is an electric, like hot plate. So when there is power, they can plug that in. And that's an emissions-free cooking strategy in the home. But where's that power coming from? It's coming from a diesel generator, right? So in the main cluster of towns in the heart of Zanskar, not far from Kumik, they get 2 or 3 hours of power every night from this diesel generator, a sooty beast. And even that's pretty sporadic. Some days they don't get anything. Now, and especially this year in the winter, because they ran out of diesel. And why did they run out of diesel? And here's where I'm going to shift into my focus on politics, because you can't really come at this problem, this huge problem, 3 billion people without clean cooking, 2 billion people without electricity, without talking about politics. And the diesel's subsidized. There are people who sell it on the black market to contractors, the guys who have the tractors and the excavators. And so these policies, and the same is true of gas cylinders in other parts of India and kerosene, these are policies designed, the subsidies, to help poor people. But they don't generally benefit. These, they're middlemen who kind of siphon off a lot of this fuel and sell it on the black market. And that was one reason they ran out of diesel. In fact, my Jeep, when I left Zanskar, and they're all diesel Jeeps, we stalled because the guy ran out of fuel, because it's so hard to find fuel there. and people dilute it, so it's low quality. But there are some encouraging signs. On the way in, I saw this brand new, small solar photovoltaic plant in the middle of nowhere. And you can get a sense, it's a sunny place, Diesel's coming over 3 mountain ranges, but the sun is hitting the ground in Zanskar all the time. And so that was really encouraging. And this question has come up when I'm in Kumik, when I'm in other places there. Let me go back. Why isn't this place blanketed with solar panels, right? I think Narendra Modi's new goal, his government, is 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022, and the energy minister is saying we'll do it faster than that. Well, you could get 112 gigawatts from Ladakh, in Zanskar, this region. That's how much sun there is. But how do you get it to where the people are? There aren't that many people up there. But even getting it at this scale to people, so they don't have to burn the diesel, which they run out of anyway, and coat their glaciers with soot, is a tricky thing. And I'm almost inclined to believe, spending a lot of time in this place, that the smaller the society, the more recalcitrant the politics. And there's a small solar plant that just went up near the old village of Kumik, just like this one. And it was exciting. People didn't have light. They didn't have power before that. People had these solar home lighting systems. Those are subsidized by the government. But you have this perfect storm of where there's corruption, as with the diesel market, and patronage kind of system. So the local political party comes in power, and who gets these solar panels is based largely on, did you vote for my party? In Kumik, they chose the wrong party, right? And so they had a half-finished solar power plant that was just sitting there, wasted capital, and they didn't have power. They rebooted it. So that was the other big piece of news when I went back in May, is they self-organized. Kumik has gotten really good at self-organizing. There's no one helping them out. So they dug this canal 7 kilometers long to bring water to their new village. They're building their own homes. Some of them passive solar heated, some of them not, to my chagrin, but we got a few dozen. And they did the same thing. So they went to their friends and family and relatives and monks in far-flung places in India who are cousins, and raised some money to replace the batteries that had kind of been deeply discharged and left in the cold weather and weren't working, and they got their own little solar power plant working. So that's what it takes up there. You kind of have to do it yourself. Now, zooming out again, we have this target that was just adopted, part of the Sustainable Development Goals, to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy for all by 2030. So this Congress is about, energy futures, looking out to 2030. That's the target we've all signed up for, whether you realize it or not. And, where do most of the people without access to clean, reliable, modern energy live? They live in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, mostly, and Southeast Asia. And there's a promising story that's been happening lately, and this is a graph from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We've heard about this yesterday a little bit. Solar modules, the price are dropping. The installed cost is plummeting. Maybe that's Moore's Law. I don't know. Whatever it is, it looks good. And then we have this new ecosystem growing of companies finally seeing this as an opportunity, right? To bring lighting, cooking, not so much heating, but lighting and cooking to people without it. The people that Kirk Smith, who some of you may know at UC Berkeley, who's done a lot of work on household air pollution for 40 years, he calls it the people living in the smoking section. The 40% of humanity still in the smoking section. How do we get them out? Well, finally, there are people seeing that as a business opportunity. So this is a graph of the sales of Pico solar lighting products in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia over the last 5 years, climbing. These are some of the companies sprouting up and taking very creative approaches to mostly giving people light bulbs and cell phone chargers, but doing it in a very innovative way, leveraging the fact that in Africa, I think there's 2/3 of the people have mobile phones now, and in India it just topped 1 billion mobile phone subscriptions. And on that platform, if you have a mobile phone, you can get over this initial cost hurdle of these solar home systems, battery, light bulb, cell phone charger, and you can pay as you go, kind of like rent to own. And not only that, but they can control it remotely. If you miss a payment, they'll shut it off remotely, turn it back on when you pay. So it's getting around this moral hazard problem of, this is not a good risk. These folks don't have a lot of income. Traditional investors don't see this as a safe investment, but these folks are they're cracking that nut in creative ways. And so these are just a few of the companies: Off-Grid Solar taking off, Mkopa, Off-Grid Electric in Tanzania, B-Box, and they're all in different ways, mostly doing that, bringing these solar home lighting systems to rural areas, but also some urban areas. And here's one that I visited in Uttar Pradesh in India, Marigal Power. They put solar panels on one house and send it to all the neighbors. And it's the same thing. It's some light, it's a cell phone charger. And I think yesterday it came up that surely we mean more when we say energy access than some light bulbs and a cell phone charger. And I'm going to come back to that when I close, and I couldn't agree more. But it's worth keeping in mind that there's still 1 billion people who don't even have that, right? They're using kerosene. And so there are other actors that are coming up, building markets. These are partnerships. These are initiatives like Power for All, Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, the World LPG Association, Power Africa is a USAID initiative to add 30,000 megawatts pretty quickly. And they're all pushing it in various ways, coming at this problem. But that's encouraging, right? Like this is finally, there seems to be some momentum around this, what's been largely an overlooked problem. But there's this investment gap, right? And so the big takeaway from this part of my talk, I just want to emphasize, is that there's really nowhere near the scale of investment happening that's required. This is a recent report that's just looking at approved public climate finance and how much is going to clean cooking, decentralized energy. It's a pittance, right? And there's a graph just kind of demonstrating that. And there are other forms of finance pouring into this sector, but the takeaway is that this graph is a useful proxy for the message that we're sending people in places like Zanskar, which is, this old proverb in a lot of Northern European cultures, goes way back: if you want fire, you have to endure the smoke. That's essentially the message, right? While we're building this ecosystem and trying to figure this out, keep burning dung. Now, here I just want to wrap up by zooming back into Kumik and Zanskar. And so the other reason I wrote this book is I thought there were some pretty profound lessons in this tiny village that, it's always a risky thing to do to talk about global citizenry, that whole concept, but that we could apply it at a much larger scale. And one of those is this idea of, it's called Chulen Melen. So Chulen Melen literally in their language means water connection, fire connection. So a lot of travelers in this region have said, how do people survive here in this rain shadow? Water's so scarce, it's cold, it's not a lot of fuel. They're at the bitter end of every supply chain. And the answer is this practice, this very ancient cultural practice. So what does that mean? The water connection means that stream coming down from the glaciers has to be shared equitably, right? So if I don't leave enough for my downstream neighbor, he's out of luck. His family can't grow what they need, and we're going to have problems. So they've developed some very sophisticated mechanisms for labor sharing, resource sharing, and then the fire connection. I really love the fire connection. The fire connection, so if we talk about, 2030, are we going to hit that target? The answer is no. We're going way too slow. World Bank thinks we're going to blow past it. The same number of people in 2030 will lack access to clean cooking, heating, and lighting as do today. So we're not going to make progress on that. But this is fascinating. The same number of people 30 years ago. It's been static. I'm sorry I don't have a graph to show that. But in absolute numbers of people, flat for 30 years and at least for the next 15 years. 30 years ago in Zanskar, what does energy access mean? This is really getting to the nitty-gritty. It means the fire connection. So imagine your hearth, the fire goes out. You haven't been paying attention. You're chasing after your kids. You got to go out and like milk the yak or something. And your hearth fire goes out. In winter, that's a big problem, right? Because temperatures can go down to negative 30. That's how you cook. That's how you heat. That's story time happens around this hearth. It's everything. And the answer is, the only answer, and this was back before the road was built in the 1980s, before they had kerosene, before they had matches to relight a fire, you would go next door. So you go knock on your neighbor's door and you say, hey, my fire went out. I'm sorry, it's embarrassing. It happened again. Can you give me some of your hot coals? And they put it on a metal plate and they bring it back and they would put it on their hearth and some fuel and they'd blow on it and they'd kindle it back to life. Problem solved. Fire connection. And you know, this guy Stobden, who's now become, he's a major character in the book, he's an old friend now, the guy I first met, who's explaining why they're building this new village, he told me about doing this when he was a kid, right? Like, there's Zanskar in winter. The snow used to pile high enough, you know, like 10 feet high. It's not that high anymore, but it's still cold, it's still snowy. And you still have the grandmothers doing circumambulations around the temple and with their thermoses. And that paradigm, the fire connection, I found that to be very instructive. And it's kind of how I close the book, and it's how I'll close this talk. When we're looking out on the horizon about, you know, this is one of the bigger problems we face. And I don't even mean black carbon, I mean what black carbon kind of highlights, which is the fact that 3 billion people are in the smoking section, and that is a health crisis, right? That is an urgent thing. That's every bit as urgent as your hearth fire going out, right? Think of it that way. For folks who are forced to use these fuels and polluting technologies, it's every bit as urgent. How do we close the gap? I just have a few minutes to talk about solutions, but you know, Kirk Smith has got this framework of, well, you know, you can make the clean available. What do we use? We use gas and electricity. How do we get it to folks so that, you know, they don't run out in the winter, or places that don't have access to those supply chains can use gas. It's a clean burning fuel in health terms. Or you could make the available clean. And that means, you know, all these people who are burning biomass, because that's what's freely available. How do you burn that in a way that doesn't produce any black carbon, right? And it's more efficient, so you don't spend hours in, gathering the fuel. And here's an example. This stove is called the BioLite stove, and I took it to Ergen, and I took it to folks in Kumik, and I said, you know, what do you think? This stove has a little thermoelectric generator so that you can charge it, but once it gets going, the heat from the combustion powers a fan, introduces more air, achieves pretty clean burning. You know, is it clean enough? Maybe not. They're working on it, but it represents an effort, an entrepreneurial effort to solving this problem, making the available clean. And their verdict, Ergen and Zongmo and other people I showed it to, they're like, oh, this is great. Seems not much smoke, can burn dung. How much does it cost? And that's where they got skeptical. So that's another challenge, is how do you make this affordable? Because that stove here in our market costs over $100. They're working on a version for the developing world for homes that would be a lot cheaper, but you know, it's a tough nut to crack. You know, how do we get gas, or biogas is another solution. You know, there's a gas canister riding to Zanskar on top of a diesel truck. But there are other clean fuels like biogas. This is a system in Nepal. The Biogas Sector Partnership has installed 260,000 of these in every district of the country at the household scale. They're subsidized, part of the cost. They train people on how to use them, and they offer maintenance. It's kind of a very little-known success story. How does that scale up, right? And then how do we encourage this ecosystem of players trying to tackle not just lighting, because that's an important part of the problem, but the cooking problem and the heating problem, which is totally neglected. There are a lot of people around the world who have space heating needs, and they're forced to burn these fuels, just like folks in Kumik. So here's Stolbden walking down the new village. They got some choices to make in this new village. One of which is, how are we going to provide electricity? There's a little solar-heated community hall I mentioned that we built, a little gathering space. But looking out, I asked them on this recent visit, like, what do you think? What are you going to do for power? Like, yeah, probably diesel. We'll bring lines across the river from the diesel generator in Karsha. And I was like, wow, why not solar? And they're like, oh, the politics, the local political party. We'll wait for the next party to get in power, and then maybe we'll have a chance, because that's how money flows through these channels. And then in the meantime, they're forced to stay in the smoking section and kind of bootstrap their way to solutions, right? And it may be that, market-based approaches really, they can't necessarily work up in a place like Zanskar. It's so remote. There are no retail outlets if you wanted to sell solar lanterns. Past subsidy regimes have kind of spoiled the waters for a purely kind of market-based approach, because people expect, my solar home lighting system, and people do have some of them, isn't working because the battery died 3 years ago. And I said, well, why don't you buy a new battery? And they're like, no, I'll wait. The government will give me a new one, right? And they'd feel like a fool if they went out and bought one, and their neighbors would say, look at that guy, just spent his money on a battery when the government's going to give us one next year, maybe. And so here's the group gathering on the plains of Martang and trying to figure out the next steps. And they've got a heavy lift ahead of them. I'll just close by saying this idea of the fire connection, I think it imputes a level of ambition to our various efforts, nascent efforts, around solving this energy access problem. If we really step back and think about it. Yesterday we heard a speaker talk about energy access as a human right. As we've seen, there are a lot of folks approaching this as a huge market opportunity, 500 million households that don't have clean cooking. There's another way of thinking about it, which is as a risk management framework. This pollution is accelerating the decline of snow and ice in all kinds of places, including the Arctic. Household emissions from Asia, researchers have found it goes into the high Arctic too, and contributes feedback loops there. Just looking at Kumik alone, what do they have to look forward to? Well, shrinking, tightening water supplies. And so that's the long-term survival question, even in this new village. And then the near-term survival question of, how long do we have to put up with this smoke? And I think that is a useful framework to keep in mind. We talk about Bill Gates and the Breakthrough Energy, Innovation Coalition, which is great. And we talk about other big pushes. And I wonder sometimes why, given the scale of this, even just the health problem, looking at it through that frame alone, the vaccine for polio or the current fight against malaria, household air pollution kills more people than HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria combined. So what would a push look like to really treat it with the urgency it deserves? I can tell you one thing, and I hate to end on a gloomy note, but we're not going to meet Sustainable Development Goal 7 at our current rates, right, and current levels of ambition, and not just investment, policy mechanisms, or even just sheer attention to this problem. we need a level of urgency, and not just urgency, but solidarity that I find in this practice, this ancient practice of the fire connection, right? Your neighbor's right there. If you don't get his hearth fire going, when you need his coals, you're out in the cold. And I'll just leave it there, and hopefully that leaves some time for questions. But I think absent that sense of urgency and solidarity, it's going to be hard to solve this, because these are wicked problems. And they're problems that require, if you're researching this here at Illinois, a really cross-disciplinary spirit, right? Political economy of a place like Zanskar, it's only 20,000 people. And in the 3 billion people, it doesn't seem like a lot. But if you live in Zanskar, it's the center of the world, right? So if that's our target, how are we going to get them clean energy access? We need to start taking this problem a little more seriously, and that's one reason I wrote the book, and that's a reason why it's a pleasure to come here to ring that bell amidst all of the exciting presentations on other kinds of energy frontiers. So, thanks. So hopefully that went a little long, but hopefully we have time for some questions. Yeah.
I just have a numerical question. I thought a couple of times I heard you say 20,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said 50 households.
Yeah.
So I'm mixing two things up here. What am I mixing up?
Oh, I'm sorry. So 20,000 people is Zanskar. So if I go back to that map, the region, this valley is called Zanskar. The village that's Kumek is 50 households. And so, yeah, to get a sense of scale, Zanskar is 20,000 people over the size of, is it Rhode Island? It's like the most sparsely populated part of India. And then Ladakh, of which Zanskar is a part, that broader region, is about 300,000 people within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is many million people. Yeah. Yeah.
Last year, I saw a program, I'm not sure it was on CNN, it was documentary on CNN, or it was a program on the 60 Minutes, and it was focusing on Tibet. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing was the governor of Tibet and the people of Tibet, they were against making or constructing a highway from the airport to the center of the city because of the pollution area. And so again, people were saying that, well, we don't want to have these civilizations that the Westerners want to bring here. Mm-hmm. My question to you is that the region of the world that you have visited very nicely, I mean, they have lived like that for thousands of years, not hundreds of years, thousands of years, and they have survived. Yeah. And most likely they're going to survive another thousands of years. Do you think those people really want to have a GE appliances in the kitchens, the dishwasher disposals and washer and dryer and two-door refrigerator? What is the attitude of the people toward having access to all of these things? Because you mentioned right at the end that there's a global market here. Mm-hmm. Well, forget about the capitalism part of it. But do these people really want to have these kind of things?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. Ergen, whose photo you saw with the stove, he just got a washing machine, doesn't get to use it very often. But yeah, the answer is yes. They want what we have, and why shouldn't they? The full suite of energy services. And I should add, and I've talked about this with Tammy last night, we all want energy services, right? We don't want kilowatt hours. We don't want kerosene. We want the services they provide. And yeah, Zanskaris are no different in that they want productive energy. They want, like the tractor exemplifies that, saves them a lot of time and work for farming. These are farmers. Everyone's a farmer. Some people have other jobs. And those folks with those other jobs can afford to go to the city, whether it's Kargil or Srinagar or Chandigarh, and buy appliances that they sometimes get to use. But, when thinking about what's going to happen in Zanskar 50 years from now, it's another of my stupid journalist questions I ask people a lot. and young people are leaving Zanskar. There's no educational opportunities there, so they go outside, they go to Delhi, they go to Srinagar for education, and a lot of people would study online. They like staying there. They like, living in the village, working with their family, farming, but they also want to get an education, and they don't have any way to do that because the power goes out and there's no internet. And if you want to take courses, and a lot of kids try to do this at the Indira Gandhi National Open University in Delhi, remotely, like MITx or something, edX or something like that, you can't do it. And so when we're talking about energy access, I think we should be way more ambitious than a light bulb and a cell phone charger. I think we can all agree on that. And think about the suite of, what do people need in a place even as far-flung as Zanskar? And their aspirations are surprisingly similar to ours, but are there ways to provide those energy services that aren't so wasteful and inefficient with these kinds of fuels, but also in the climate impact sense of it? So, yes. Mm-hmm.
Who funded that project, and what happened after the building was built?
I was talking about this with Tammy last night, too. So I was there as a grad student doing field research on people's energy choices and households and focusing on heating. And there was a project going on funded by the EU for 4 years through an NGO based in France called JERIS, working with 5 local NGOs in Ladakh, the Ecological Development Group. Really, they've been around a long time. They've done good work. And they were trying to promote passive solar heating, 1,000 passive solar houses or retrofit houses in this region. You've seen how remote it is. There are a lot of logistical challenges to doing that, just to getting there, let alone to working with someone to rebuild their house. So that was the project. I don't think it was that successful, and for a lot of reasons. One is that even the folks living in the city, they're from this region, they live in the city, there's a cultural lens you have to apply, and when you go into some of these communities, understanding their constraints and the fact that if you paint a wall black to make a trom wall, which is one passive solar heating strategy, it only works if you paint it black, but it's an inauspicious color to a lot of people, so they'd go back and see that they'd repainted it white. Or they'd go back into a village and say, I just gave you this pile of money to build a attached greenhouse on your house, and why haven't you done it? What'd you do with the money? He's like, I built a detached greenhouse to grow vegetables. Well, that's good, but that wasn't the plan. So it was, mixed success. What was more successful was community scale projects, where you get everyone clear expectations, like what we did, where every household in Kumik contributed 10 days of labor. Like everyone had an equal share in building that humble little building. So there are lessons there.
I think we'll bring the session to a close, and I'd like to thank Jonathan for really an excellent talk. You're a remarkable storyteller, just kept us spellbound for the last hour. And it's an inspiring story, and I think for many of us, it hopefully is, inspires us to continue to do the work that we do, and this brings out the importance and the challenges of what it is we're all striving to achieve. So please join me in thanking Jonathan for
Thank you.